Welcome to Golden Adventures, and today I'm talking about Billabong's Daughter, which I've got two copies of, a 1990s one and this coverless 1950s version. This is printed in 1924 and it contains, as a warning, the race, class and gender themes that you would expect from a novel published in 1924. Now, a quick summary of what happens. It begins a very exciting opening. Nora's out riding and she sees a runaway buggy. She manages to sort of rescue the people in the buggy. It's Mrs. O'Reilly and her daughter Mary Kate and their new Irish immigrants. She takes them back to where they have their settler's cottage, and as time passes she discovers that Mrs. Riley is ill. She and Tommy visit her and take care of her, and then when Mrs. Riley collapses and has to go to hospital, they take care of Mary Kate and they renovate their house for them, and they nurse Mrs. Riley when she's released from hospital. So also Tommy is doing some cooking, and bank robber interrupts her, but luckily he's scared off by Jim, and at a later point when they're mustering cattle, they find the bank robber in the bush, and he's sort of sorry for what he's done, and they decide that the easiest thing to do to give him a new start would be to just shave him, give him some new clothes and take him to the train and send him on his way, which is what they do. They muster some cattle, and there's a very dramatic interlude because Nora has to dismount from her horse, and she is then attacked by a mean and also sneaky bull that keeps sort of stalking her rather than charging her. So she's about to be killed by this terrible bull when Wally rides to her rescue and manages to save the day. And it's very dramatic, and afterwards Wally confesses to Jim that he has come to care too much for Nora, and he feels that he can't continue to stay here at Billabong under false pretenses when she thinks of him as a brother, and he no longer thinks of her as his sister. And then while Jim's mulling that over, immediately Wally gets a telegram calling him up to Queensland because his brother is ill. So he has to shoot through and go to Queensland, and when he gets there his brother has died, and his silly sister-in-law is being defrauded by a nasty, I don't know what you call him, like a nasty member of staff. And Wally has to try to sort all of that out, and while he's investigating it all, he is at an outstation and he gets attacked by a crazy outstation worker who's been egged on by the main villain, and he's left for dead with a broken leg and a terrible head wound. It's actually quite traumatic. I say, after the death of Bob's, it's the second most grueling thing that happens to anyone in Billabong books. But then miraculously he's rescued by a passing aeroplane that spots him on the ground, and the plane's flown by a guy called Freddie Paxham, who picks him up and takes him to Brisbane, and then Jim and Nora come, and they use the aeroplane to actually find the missing cattle that are being stolen. But more importantly, Wally wakes up in the hospital and sort of cuts back to the hospital, and Nora and Wally are now engaged without having to go through a proposal. They've just come to the realization that when Nora rushed to his sick bed, she too felt that he was not like her brother, that he was more, it was a different bond. So they've reached the point of engagement. Rescues. All right. This novel is jam-packed with them. Nora rescues the Rileys from their runaway horse. She takes care of Mrs. Riley in her house, renovates her house, and nurses her back to health and takes care of her daughter. Jim scares away the bank robber, but then later on feels sorry for him, so he and Wally sort of help him to get on his way to start a new life. And also there's a bonus flashback rescue because they encounter somebody who knew Mr. Linton when he was young, who tells them all about a very dramatic interlude where Mr. Linton rode out and got a doctor for a woman who really needed it, and crossed raging rivers and did amazing things to get medical attention to this lady. There's also, of course, a reverse rescue when Freddie Paxton rescues Wally, who's basically dying in the middle of nowhere near a burnt-out hut with a broken leg. And he flies him off in his plane. And, of course, Nora nurses Wally back to health. The beginning of the novel reads, I think, to me differently to the way it was intended to be read. It begins with a description of there used to be this bog, and it was full of animals and insects and birds, and it was like a swamp, but now settlers have come and they're using it fruitfully. So you're meant to say, oh yes, good, the colonisation project is ongoing. Whereas I, as a 21st century Australian, I'm like, oh my god, why are you destroying this natural habitat? Oh, it's full of wildlife that's irreplaceable. This is why Australia has the worst extinction record of every continent. There's a later point where Wally and Nora are teaching Mary Kate how to be a real Australian, and they begin by teaching her how to kill a snake. I'm like, no, the snake's almost certainly endangered. Don't kill the snake. Don't kill the snake. Best thing to do, avoid the snake. Don't kill it. It's part of the ecosystem. So, I'm interpreting that in a way which is not, I think, in line with the original intent of the text. Romance. Bruce didn't really want to write romance, which was effectively pushed into it. This is one of her responses in a 1923 letter to a fan. It's very nice to hear that you like my books, but why be in such a hurry for Nora to marry anyone? I think she is far too young. Then later on, in 1939, she did an interview with a magazine where she said, hundreds of children all over Australia clamoured for more Nora, so, I went on writing books. I was very firm about one point, however, and that was that there should be no love interest in them. I was more or less forced into marrying off Nora and Wally eventually, but beyond this, I drew the line. That line is that unwillingness to write romance is one of the more significant differences between Mary Grant Bruce and Ethel Turner, whom she's constantly compared to because they were two biggest best-selling girls' story or children's authors in Australia. Turner had no problem with romance. Even the second novel she wrote about after Seven Little Australians was at first titled Growing Up. She was quite happy to have romance, but Bruce did not, and she put it off as long as she could, and then she did not have a lot of romance. I was particularly impressed at the way she manages to have the entire proposal off screen, that you don't see them. You don't see Wally propose to her or her propose to Wally. I don't even know, because he would have been on his sick bed at the time. No, it's just sorted. They've just come to an agreement and they calmly move on from there. I'm very fond of their romance. It's a quiet, but strongly felt bond. Modern editions of Bruce come with a warning which says some of Bruce's earlier works are considered to have had offensive and dated content, particularly in regards to racial stereotypes of Australian Aborigines, Chinese and Irish immigrants, and her earlier belief in the theory of social Darwinism. More recent reprints of the Billabong series have been edited to remove controversial material. I had forgotten how prominent a role the Irish immigrants have in Billabong's daughter, but there's an awful lot about the Rileys and their immigration. I guess in the 1920s there was a significant effort there was a lot of promotion of immigration to Australia, and of course a fair amount of that was Irish, because they would be leaving the difficulties as the division between North and South Ireland was worked out in the 1920s. Bruce herself, her father was an Irish immigrant, and she was married to her second cousin, who was sort of held a title, not a title, but held a property in Ireland, was an Anglo-Irish landlord, I guess you'd call them. And she lived in Ireland for quite considerable periods. So she was very fond of Ireland. She does have that unfortunate belief that she can write Irish dialect, which even her husband pointed out that she couldn't. Yes, and there is a tendency to say that the Irish are a bit, lackadaisical and laid back and whimsically, impractical. But I don't think that's actually very much apparent in this book. It was in Jim and Wally when they were holidaying in Ireland, and they kept encountering people who didn't understand the concept of time effectively, whereas the Rileys are sensible, practical people who've, I guess, chosen to immigrate to Australia. I am very fond of Billabong's daughter. It's a lovely romance for me. There's a lot of adventuring around, but the whole trip that Wally has to Queensland effectively functions to show that he can work independently and solve problems on his own and be a man on his own. And then once he's done that, he's worthy to, marry Nora and come back and have a permanent home, which is just, very nice, because he has been like a little orphan his whole life, and now he finally is actually part of the Linton family. So yes, I'm very fond of this one. It's one of my favourites.